It was the 5th day since I had walked out of my room and seen the light. I had held myself captive for days. That evening, my parents knocked on my door and hesitantly told me that the journalist had visited again to speak with me. She had attempted to contact me and my parents on the phone multiple times before I stepped out, and since then she has begun to visit my home. She must have followed me on my way back home, and imagining someone was stalking me after all that had happened was horrifying. It was difficult to escape that horror, and I only developed more fear and hate towards her. Earlier that day, when the news came out that the trio's bail plea was rejected, I was elated. My resentment towards her couldn't prevent me from agreeing to an interview, but I insisted it to be conducted only via phone. The next morning, I waited for a call. The wait made me nervous. My therapist had advised me to imagine standing on a riverbank, watching a boat being rowed towards me whenever I felt that way. After I expressed concerns about the boat capsizing and the rower drowning, she sent me a painting of a boat in the middle of the river with a man in the act of rowing it to the bank. When the call came, it was exactly 10 a.m. She began by apologizing for hounding me, and I remained quiet. She followed up with a thank you, but I stayed silent once again. Finally, she asked what had made me agree to the interview, something that required my response. That was the longest silence of the call. I remember going down the path of where it all began, flooded with flashes of memories. The times I locked myself in my room, haunted by nightmares, while my parents underwent therapy to cope with the changes in my behavior. How I agreed to sign up for the treatment while I was caught up in deciding between whether it was the joy from the rejection or the bail plea, or the courage I gathered from the therapy sessions. But I wasn't ready to face those moments, so I chose not to answer. She welcomed the silence and reassured me. You can remain silent if you are uncomfortable answering a question. I responded with an informal sound, a sound that wasn't any meaningful word. When did you discover the evidence? She asked. I remained silent again. If I had stayed quiet for a few more seconds, she might have assumed I was uncomfortable and moved on. But there was nothing uncomfortable in answering that question. It was on my desk. I had stopped attending school, so I used it for my therapy notes. Only after my therapist helped me with nightmares and the numbness from the shock was I able to see the evidence in it. During that time, I was trembling almost constantly. Even going to sleep was terrifying. I would be pushed into a corner. Sweat would run down my face amidst shouts directed at me, and tears would stream from my clenched eyes while a gun was pointed at my forehead. I would wake up just before the shot came out. This was a recurring scene each night. Each night it was a different person with an unfamiliar face who would fire the shot. She asked me to write about these experiences as I lived them, and guided me to rewrite them to make them less distressing. I replayed the visuals of the rewritten narratives multiple times each day. It took me a few weeks to overcome the fear and anxiety associated with those nightmares, though I still have them occasionally. Do you remember the date on which you discovered the evidence? I remember shaking my head as if she could see my gesture and telling her I didn't. The reporter was polite enough to ask if she could jog my memory to find out when I discovered it. I didn't understand why she needed the date, but today I assume that journalists, like historians, are obsessed with dates and times. How many days after the incident? How many days before the current day? After how many days did you start therapy? How many days after you started therapy? Do you remember the clothes you wore, the food you ate, or any other activities you did that day? I remained silent for all those questions and told her I couldn't recall. I was given the freedom to decline food I didn't like and choose the ones I did, as well as to wear the clothes I wanted. Although I didn't fully capitalize on this freedom as much as I had craved and fought for it before the incident, it reassured me that I still had some control over my choices and my life. I was also asked to pick up a hobby. Bound to my room, I took up drawing. I kept my mind occupied and distracted me from my fears and anxiety during the time I spent drawing. My therapist would collect my drawings, color them, and return them to me. I always found them to be more beautiful than they had been originally. I still draw to this day. It's all right, let's move on, she said, and asked, with whom did you first talk about the evidence? With my therapist. What did you tell her? I told her the notebook they bought for me had a small yellow sticker with the store name in red. What did she say? Did she approve it? She did. She said it would help the police catch the trio. And then you called the police, is that right? No, I didn't. I told my therapist that I was afraid and I didn't want to do anything that would make me talk to new people. She advised you too, but you didn't. My therapy didn't start easily as I refused to meet any new people after the incident. My therapist, who was treating my mother and my father, tried to reach me through various means. My parents, my nannies from where I was growing up, making herself audible through the door and sending me notes. After all those failed attempts, one day she sent an audio recording explaining what she would be doing and how it would help me. There was a fleeting moment of relief while listening to the recording. If you feel that someone has snatched control of your life from you, reach out to me. Let's get it back. I could barely recreate and relive that moment of relief. I recorded my nightmare and mailed it to her, which marked the beginning of my therapy. Initially, our communication was limited to exchanging recordings. I'd send her one and she'd send me one back. However, as I began to overcome the nightmares and started to believe in the process, I transitioned to having sessions over the phone. Can I assume that your therapist told your parents and they informed the police? She asked. No, she never revealed it to anyone. She often noted that letting the police know could significantly lessen my fears. So you called the police. Yes, when my fear became overwhelming, my therapist advised me to stay hopeful if the police couldn't catch them. Did the police believe you? Yes. Honestly, they didn't. They asked if I could pass the phone to my parents, but I refused. They then requested my address for procedural purposes and used it to meet my parents and confirm the details. The police also had a tough time with me. My therapist had to help them understand my condition. They scheduled and participated in several calls to get a detailed account of the events. All of the people I had spoken to about the incident, the police were the only ones who believed me without further questioning. When I mentioned that I had requested them to buy a new notebook to complete my homework and they got one for me. How did you know that the police had caught them? When my therapist informed me that I might need to go with them to identify the trio. So this was the first time you left your house after the incident? Yes. Did you agree to go out immediately? No. The police, for security reasons, insisted I travel with them for the identification parade. I refused and said I would prefer to travel with my family. Following my therapist's advice, my parents informed the police that I would not be taking any questions directly and didn't want to be around strangers. I waited in a closed room, visualizing a boat being rowed towards me. The boat capsized and sank, but the rower managed to swim to the bank. How did you identify them? By their voices. Didn't the police show you their faces? No, that would have scared me. I only heard their voices. I was presented with many voices, almost 20 in total. I sat in the center of the room with a desk and was given headphones. The people on the other side of the room were instructed to speak, one after another. Whenever a voice sounded familiar, I was asked to raise my hand. I raised my hand for 7 voices, including one female voice that belonged to my school teacher. They must have included her voice to test the sanity of my ears. The remaining 6 voices came from the 3 individuals and their nearly identical mimics. It was challenging to distinguish the 3 original voices from the copies. How did you distinguish those voices? Do you remember them? No, I asked the voice and its mimic to say, "Drop your jaw down." I had a lucid dream of jumping out through my room's window on my skateboard before gaining consciousness and opening my eyes to darkness. I realized I was blindfolded, my throat was dry, and I cried for water. I heard footsteps approaching. Someone tried to give me water from a bottle, but it spilled over me. He grabbed my hair, tilted my head and said, "Drop your jaw down." From a distance I heard another man say, "He's scared, the kid might laugh." Ha ha ha. Mocking the person feeding me. Scared to say, "Open your mouth." I requested the police to have the 2 voices repeat the phrase, "Drop your jaw down" multiple times until I finally chose one. I must have sensed a note of suppression in one of those 2 similar voices. You picked one of them? Yes. And you picked the right one? How were you able to distinguish the other 2 from the sound alikes? I just went with the ones that felt right. Soon after the blinds were removed and I opened my eyes, I felt terrified, yet I found myself engaged in the activity of matching the voices to their physiques. Their faces were covered with openings only for their eyes and nose. There were two of them, both speaking. I couldn't hear the voice of the guy who had fed me water. I assumed he must have gone out. Earlier, the trio had argued over whose turn it was to call my father. The two later bickered over who should handle my hunger, thirst and toilet needs. It seemed too much for those two. They shut the doors tight, removed the blinds and untied me. When the third one returned, he was shocked to see me roaming around. He confronted the others, but their mockery quickly silenced him. By then, I had matched the voices to the physiques they belonged to. Did you ask one of the three for a new notebook, or did you appeal to all the three? I asked the guy who suggested removing my blinds. The third guy, when he came back, didn't reveal that my father agreed to pay the amount they demanded until he was done with his argument with the other two over letting me free in that compound. He added my father needed some more time. More than the idea that I was going to be free, my thoughts went around the school and the next day and the homework. That was purely the effect of my teacher's counseling at the beginning of the year based on my previous year's grades. When I opened the book, I found the last page filled. I waited for the moment when I could speak freely with the guy who seemed to be leading the trio. This guy had a quirky attitude. I laughed at the jokes he cracked. I found him to be harmless. I went to him and told him that I needed a new notebook, and he looked puzzled. I told him that I might have to visit the school the next day after they had released me. He called the same guy who fed me water, made the ransom call and ordered him to fetch a book for me. He denied it, and he was threatened that his mask would be removed if he didn't go. I think I laughed at that moment again and probably got him angry. I don't think it was difficult to choose. No, it wasn't difficult. Then they showed you their lower halves? Yes, they were wearing the same footwear. Police took me into another room and asked me to stand at a black line marking. They informed me that I would be presented with suspects and assured me of my safety, explaining that the suspects wouldn't see me and were unaware of what was on my side. The setup was a small frame. With each person walking into the frame, chills ran down my body, reminding me of the shock I had felt when the guy who fed me water had pulled out a gun and pointed it at my forehead. The other two men had always mocked him, and sometimes I had laughed at the jokes they cracked about him. I almost sided with the two, exhibiting a similar superiority towards him while asking for more water. This might have angered him, lending him to point the gun at me. In the frame, I could only see him from chest to feet. As he turned around following orders, I recognized his arms. They were broad, and a gun would look small in his hands, just like it was. I also recognized his footwear. That's how I identified him. And you identified all three this way? Yes, one of them had long hair and the same footwear. You matched the voices you had picked with the three bodies you identified? Yes. Impressive. You caught all of them. How are you feeling now? Good. My therapist says I have improved. Nice. And what do you think? I struggle to speak for myself because I lack trust in my judgment. Deep down I fear I might not be a good person. Oh, come on. Don't think about yourself like that. My therapist asked me many times if I was hiding anything or suppressing my feelings. I remained silent. One day she shared a story from her morning walk about how she felt compassion for a limping dog only to realize later that it was faking the injury. She felt sorry for the compassion she developed after discovering that. I listened quietly, and after a long pause, I opened up. I told her I had trusted the person I approached for the book. When the guy among the trio, who was the target of mockery, pointed a gun at me, I waited, expecting the one I placed my trust in to save me. But instead, he took the gun from the other person, aimed it at me, and backed me into a corner. I broke down in tears, telling my therapist that I was a terrible person and an opportunist to place trust in one of them. She comforted me, explaining that it's a normal psychological response for hostages to develop trust and compassion towards their captors. She referred it to as Stockholm Syndrome and assured me it shouldn't be viewed in the light of opportunism. Despite her reassurances, I wasn't fully convinced, but I clung to the idea that people develop different responses in difficult situations, revealing various facets of their nature, and I hated myself. Gradually, I lost trust in my instincts. "You're a good person. What happened shouldn't have happened," she said. "Now that they're behind bars, things will get better." I sensed the journalist's words were modest, and I remained calm. "I wish you a speedy recovery. I hope you leave your room soon and start to feel normal again." A few days later, I agreed to meet my therapist and planned to visit the skate park. But on the day I was supposed to go, I read an article in the newspaper about my interview. I didn't meet my therapist, nor did I go to the skate park. My therapist filed a petition against the journalist and the newspaper for disclosing that I was undergoing therapy. I later learned that the journalist lost her job. She wrote me a letter going to great lengths to prove it was never her intention to disclose that I was undergoing therapy, sincerely apologizing for her mistake. Although I forgave her, I never fully trusted anyone again. For years, I waited for someone to come and tell me that my pain was over and that I was free. Eventually, I realized no one would come. I began to say to myself that I was free now.